Morning everyone, welcome to the next lesson on Lady Macbeth. So we did lesson 31 was actually is actually this one. So we did it in a slightly different order. Did lesson 30 about Lady Macbeth, then looked at the theme of evil, and then we're going back one step. So lesson 31 now, which is about Lady Macbeth again. So drawing together the two things we've looked at, this tells us that we're going to be able to understand a bit better about the idea of Lady Macbeth being evil. Sure, but perhaps there's an alternative perspective. I want you to begin this lesson by looking through the 7. I'll get it right eventually. Well, print that way. There we go. 7 events in the play involving Lady Macbeth, and put them in order about how about when they occurred. So pause that video, give this a go, and then unpause it, and we'll see how well you did. Okay, so the answers are, or the order you should have it, are B. Lady Macbeth received Macbeth's letter convincing herself to do anything to make her husband king. G. Lady Macbeth graciously welcomes King Duncan to Dunsinane Castle. D. Lady Macbeth convinces Macbeth to appear innocent but to follow her lead in the assassination of King Duncan. A. Macbeth tries to talk himself out of killing King Duncan, but Lady Macbeth berates him as a coward. E. Whilst Macbeth commits the crime, Lady Macbeth demonstrates that she too has doubts about the murder. F. Lady Macbeth takes the knives from Macbeth and smears the groomsmen with blood to frame them. That means it must be C. Lady Macbeth and Macbeth envy the dead who sleep in peace while they live in constant fear of losing it all. So that is the starter. Next, I would like you to read Act 5, Scene 1, where we see Lady Macbeth sleepwalking, and her conversation or her dialogue is overheard by a waiting gentlewoman, so like a maid, and a doctor. She reveals to them all of her guilty secrets. So read through that scene now. I will attach that to the lesson, and then unpause the video, and we'll look at these questions together. Okay. So why is this scene written mostly in prose? Some Shakespeare enthusiasts, experts, not like me, feel that when a character is rhyming, that suggests they're particularly senior in the hierarchy. Well, that's not always true, but is a decent rule of thumb. So now she's no longer speaking iambic pentameter, or her words are not rhyming. It suggests that perhaps she has now fallen down the hierarchy, and she is now just like anybody else. She's no longer a part of the nobility. It also could suggest that because there's no logical ordering or pattern to her speech, she's now demonstrating a sort of signs of madness, that she has changed her way of speaking, and that tells us that perhaps she is losing her mind. How do you feel about Lady Macbeth now? So you might feel, well, tough luck, sunshine. You are the one who got involved in the murders. What do you expect? This is karma. This is the balancing of the world. This is yin and yang. Or you might feel, well, all she did was encourage her husband to do well, and yes, you know, we might now in modern times view that as going too far, as, you know, killing someone. Perhaps at the time, certainly maybe not the 16th century, 17th century rather, but the 11th century, when Macbeth was a real person and the kings of Scotland would have fought quite brutally, maybe that's just how it is. So we may feel somewhat that her mental degradation is unjustified. So what impression does the doctor have of Lady Macbeth? So he says that unnatural deeds have unnatural ends, and the idea that she is unnatural, and so he has seen people sleepwalk who have died peacefully in their beds, not been racked with guilt. So he already thinks that there is something wrong, and it ties back into the idea of nature being disrupted, this great chain of being disrupted by these crimes that Macbeth and Lady Macbeth have committed. Right, so now you've had a little go at that, it's up to you to start working on our comparative skills. So I'm going to give you a pair of lines from Lady Macbeth, and you're going to explain in a paragraph what they tell us about her as a character. So we'll do the first one together, then there'll be 2 more for you to do. So the first one, the first pair of lines come from Act 5, Scene 1, and I've put the line numbers in the quotations as well. So the first is out, damned spot. Out, damned spot, Act 5, Scene 1. The second line is, who would have thought the old man to have had so much blood in him? Who would have thought the old man to have had so much blood in him? So what do they tell us about Lady Macbeth? Don't worry, we're doing it together, and I've already got an answer for you. So, in these lines, we know already that Lady Macbeth is talking in her sleep, so we've established what's happening, suggesting she is having nightmares about being discovered as a participant of the murder of Duncan, so a conspirator perhaps. And Shakespeare uses the contrast between a tiny thing like a spot. So a spot in this context would be just a small thing, a small piece of evidence that the modern day CSIs would pick up on. That would be enough to incriminate her. So the contrast between a tiny thing like a spot with so much blood to show her fear increasing. So you see, as it's very close together, those 2 lines, only separated by one other line. And during her day, her sort of nightmare, her dream, this fear increases. Lady Macbeth even says, all the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this little hand. The idea that even all of this blood is impossible to hide, the smell of it, using all of the perfumes available. So that shows that she's demonstrating a sense of panic of being discovered. And the audience, aware of how complicit she is in Duncan's murder, might feel that her mental anguish is absolutely just and fair in response to the gravity of the murder of a king. But they would have considered the king, certainly the Stuart or the Jacobean audience would have considered the king to have been appointed by God and therefore entitled to that position. Obviously Shakespeare was aware of that and would have incorporated the emphasis on unnatural or the break of the unnatural order of things to impress King James I, and he would have consciously demonstrating that treason, the murder of a king, should have very grave consequences for the perpetrator, both in terms of them being punished, in terms of an attempt to, such as that happened with the Gunpowder Plot. It was, you saw that Guy Fawkes was hung, drawn, and quartered in terms of his capital punishment. But the idea that even Lady Macbeth, who's been a bit part player or a co-conspirator, is mentally torn by this moment. So that act has now changed her as a person. So that first one, you can see how we've started looking at establishing what's going on when these words are being said. We then talk about a technique there. So Shakespeare uses a contrast between 2 things. That's a good technique we can talk about. Then we can maybe bring in any other information we have from other scenes. So we don't have to, but that always demonstrates that you have a great understanding of the play as a whole. So you might think, well, actually, I can bring in that quote, I can bring in that quote. Or I can bring that event. It hasn't got to be a quote, just an event that happened earlier on in the play just shows that you understand her development and progression as a character. Relating it back to the audience is important, so make sure we do that as well. And lastly, keeping it contextual, so making sure that we talk about the importance to Shakespeare, the audience, or perhaps the perception of society at the time. So making sure we bring those answers back to just demonstrate your understanding of what's being said, your understanding of how the character develops, and how that impacts on the audience, as well as the context. Do not forget context. Right, we've had a little look at that. I've given you a little bit of a breakdown of what that paragraph does. Our next one, sorry, I did highlight, and I forgot to mention, those key bits. So we talked about the contrast and the audience, because those are things that we often forget. So the technique here is contrast or juxtaposition, if you wish, and the audience would have responded in what way. Make sure you incorporate those 2 things that we often miss out. And lastly, the context that I mentioned before. Right at the end of that piece of writing, at the bottom, there we go, we talk about relation to King James, his beliefs, Shakespeare's intentions. So those, again, are very important to remember, so that your writing demonstrates a broader understanding than just that from what's in that extract. Right, 2 more pairs of quotes, and your task is to then create a short paragraph like that, in that same structure. The first pair, Lady Macbeth says, "What's done is done. in Act 3, Scene 2. So earlier on, once Duncan's been murdered, what's done is done. Lovely. Now, fast forward to Act 5, Scene 1, where she says, what's done cannot be undone. Surely that's the same thing. What's done is done. What's done cannot be undone. So perhaps there we might look at how there is that juxtaposition again. That might be a good way to start off by exploring the fact that she is in the beginning of the first of those lines talking about murdering King Duncan, and in the second line it's now where she's sleepwalking again. That's the first one for you to analyse in your first paragraph. Your second paragraph comes from the third pair of quotes, where Lady Macbeth says, a little water clears us of this deed, in Act 2, Scene 2. So the idea that we can do it and be done with it. And after he has murdered Duncan, Macbeth says, so I'm introducing an additional character, not just Lady Macbeth. Macbeth says, will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hand? No, this my hand will rather the multitudinous seas incarnadine, making the green one red. So now we're adding the idea of Macbeth having a part in Lady Macbeth's state of mind, where she says, a little water clears us of this deed, whilst he says, will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hand? No, this my hand will rather the multitudinous seas incarnadine, to turn something red, making the green one red. So look at how those lines work together, what they tell us about Lady Macbeth. So tackle those now, pause this video and come back and we'll move on to the next task together. Good. All right. The last thing we'll ask you to do is there are 6 key moments I've picked out of where Lady Macbeth is presenting us with some pause for thought about what she's like as a character. And I would like you to look at those points on the screen and choose one word for each. So what impression we get of Lady Macbeth based on this scene, your answer must be a one-word answer. For the first one, for instance, Lady Macbeth receives Macbeth's letter, convincing herself to do anything to make her husband king. Now, you might choose a word like manipulative, or conniving, or mysterious, or plotting. But you need to pick one word that summarises our impression of Lady Macbeth, as if we're sat in the audience watching this play unfold. So then work your way through these 6 parts of the play, and that should be it for the day. So thank you very much for watching, and see you again tomorrow.